thank you very much for having me. Do I need a microphone? I mean, I'm fine speaking. Is this on? All right. If you guys can hear me, I'm fine. Okay. Well, good morning to you all. Okay. Good morning to you all. Glad to see you this morning. And I do want to take a minute and echo both what Michael and Scott said, and also I know you're going to hear from Richard here in a few minutes. But it is important that not only do we vote, but we vote all the way down the ballot. I share the same experience that Michael and Scott have with Governor Deal. I appreciate that we have a steady hand at the wheel there. We have someone who is driven by conservative principles. He's also a very good leader. He's a very good listener. I've seen him take people who are opposed to him on an issue, and by listening to them, alter his plans in taking into some of their concerns, and I appreciate the way he's led. He's talked, and they mentioned criminal justice reform, something I care very deeply about. And one of the things I've seen in watching the governor lead is not only has he wanted to do this as it helps save the taxpayer some money, you can also see for him it's an issue, it's about doing the right thing. It's about giving people who paid their debt to society an opportunity to get started again. And so when we talk about the criminal justice reform, when we talk about the Department of Corrections, the whole point is so that they can correct their lives and get back on track. And so I just want to echo what they said. And I want to ask you, I've gotten to know Richard a little bit during the campaign. There are a few people in politics who I think have a more sincere heart for service, a love for God and country. And so I just want to make sure, I want to put my two words in there for these two gentlemen. I want to talk to you first before I get into the issue of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. I introduced a bill this past session that while I had not intended there to be controversy, I thought I was doing something that we could all kind of get behind and be excited about. It did cause some controversy. I want to give you a little bit of background of who I am and why I'm in politics, because it plays into why I introduced this measure. In the summer of 2002, a church that my wife and I are members of, just down the street, First Baptist Woodstock, had asked me to help chaperone a trip of high school students to Washington, D.C. And while I was not involved in politics at the time, I cared about politics, and I actually spent a lot of time mentoring young people. And so the idea of D.C. and teenagers was pretty cool to me. Politics and teenagers, this is fantastic. And so while we were there, one of the last things we did is we went to the Holocaust Museum. And for those of you who have not been through that, I urge you in the strongest sense, please, next time you're in D.C., set aside several hours and wear very comfortable shoes. Don't wear attractive shoes, but wear very comfortable shoes because it's a hard floor. And by the end of it, your feet will be hurting anyway. But as we went through it, there were 3 touch points in that exhibit that really set me on the path of being involved in politics. What you do is you ride up to the top floor, and then you kind of walk your way down the exhibit. And on the first floor, if I remember correctly, you come down that first hallway and you turn left, and there's a plaque. And it was the list, essentially the list of people that the Nazis had said, this is life unworthy of life. And they listed gypsies and Jehovah's Witnesses and homosexuals and Jews, and says, this is life unworthy of life. What a chilling phrase. See, in America, we have this debate on when life begins, and I am decidedly very, very clear about when I believe life begins. But the Nazis were saying, we agree these people are alive, they just don't deserve to be alive. It was a chilling phrase. So I went further down the exhibit, and then there was a time, as I mentioned, my feet were killing me, and there was a place where you could watch some newsreels, sit down and watch these TV clips. And so I sat down, just if nothing else, just for the relief, and sat down for 20, 30 minutes and watched these clips. And I came away after watching all of those clips with with the realization that America knew what was happening in Europe, but didn't have the political will to do anything about it. And I remember as a teenager, my father telling me anytime World War II would come on, he said, boy, you need to sit down and watch this. You need to understand the sacrifices the previous generations have made so that we can enjoy the freedom that we do. And as any self-respecting teenager of my time would do, Dad, the guys are going to play ball. I've got to go. I had better things to do then. And so it was really eye-opening for me to see this and to see put into these news clips. You realize, wow, we knew what was happening. And then the last thing, perhaps one of the most famous quotes during that era from a Protestant minister who said, and I'm going to summarize, I may not get it exactly right. It says, first they came for the communists, and I wasn't a communist, so I said nothing. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I wasn't a trade unionist, so I said nothing. And then they came for the Jews, and I wasn't a Jew, so I said nothing. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So those three touch points really crystallized in me the importance of finding principled men and women, people who would do the right thing, even when it's politically unpopular. And so that's what began my journey. And as I began to study what is the proper role of government, of course, I mean, even at that time I was very much a conservative Republican, but as I began to study and think about what is the proper role of government, become gripped by the Declaration of Independence, our founding document. And in the second paragraph, it begins with, we hold, and I know you know this, but it's important for me to repeat it. I think it's important for us to keep hearing it. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So, if you break that down, we hold these truths to be self-evident. They are so clear, they don't even have to be defended. That all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that rights don't come from government. Rights come from the Creator. Among these, there are more than these, but among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the right to make your own way. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That the fundamental role of government is to protect the rights that the Creator has granted the individual. So if you want to understand me, if you want to understand what I think the conservative movement is about, it is about protecting the individual, protecting rights, what Barry referred to as natural rights, that the Creator has granted the individual. So with that, I want to tell you a little bit about the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, give you a little bit of background on that, and share with you where we are in this process. First, in this past session, as I did a little bit of study on protecting religious expression, came to realize that Georgia was one of about 20 states that did not have this code in their state code, this language in their state code. And so I set out to do what, again, I thought was going to bring liberals and conservatives and Republicans and Democrats together. The idea of protecting religious expression is a very passionate American ideal. And so when I walked into this, I didn't think I was walking into a battle. And I found out differently a few weeks later. So give you a little bit of background on the history of religious freedom and the first, you think about, well, isn't that guaranteed by the First Amendment? Yes, it is. But in 1990, the Supreme Court, in a ruling, changed what had been the fundamental understanding, the traditional understanding of what the free exercise of religion meant. In the past, government it was widely accepted that government was not allowed to interfere with an individual's free exercise of religion unless there was a compelling state interest and it was the least restrictive means possible. In other words, as a realtor, my language for that is government had to have a darn good reason. I'm not an attorney, so I don't speak in legalese. I speak in normal language, I think. Thank you. For those of you who chuckled, I appreciate that. That wasn't intended to. Thank you again. And so government had to have a compelling state interest if it was going to interfere with somebody's free exercise of religion. Well, in 1990, the Supreme Court essentially changed that understanding by ruling that if a law had general applicability, that no longer did government have to pass what we refer to as the strict scrutiny test. So general applicability, meaning if a law applies to everybody, regardless of its impact on religion, then government didn't have to pass this threshold. Thankfully, we had a Congress at that time, controlled by the other party, that reacted to that and said, this is unacceptable. And so in 1993, the Congress passed the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, signed into law by that uber right-winger Bill Clinton. And here are a couple of things he said as he was signing this into law. This act reverses the Supreme Court's decision, Employment Division against Smith, and reestablishes a standard that better protects all Americans of all faiths in the exercise of their religion in a way that I am convinced is far more consistent with the intent of the founders of this nation than the Supreme Court decision. come on, this is Bill Clinton. More than 50 cases have been decided against individuals making religious claims against government action since that decision was handed down. This act will help to reverse that trend by honoring the principle that our laws and institutions should not impede or hinder, but rather should protect and preserve fundamental religious liberties. What this law basically says is that government should be held to a very high level of proof before it interferes with someone's free exercise of religion. This judgment is shared by the people of the United States as well as by the Congress. We believe strongly that we can never be too vigilant in this work. And he concludes his remarks, and I've skipped over quite a bit, but he concludes his remark this way. We are a people of faith. We have been so secure in that faith that we have enshrined in our Constitution for protection for people who profess no faith, and good for us for doing so. That is what the First Amendment is all about. But let us never believe that the freedom of religion imposes on any of us some responsibility to run from our convictions. Let us instead respect one another's faiths, fight to the death to preserve the right of every American to practice whatever convictions he or she has, but bring our values back to the table of American discourse to heal our troubled land. So the history of this measure has been bipartisan. It is the idea of protecting religious expression, something that has united conservatives and liberals since the beginning of our country. And so where we are now is because of it. So this bill passed in the federal level in 1993. The Supreme Court ruled in 1997 that that only applied to federal courts. It did not apply to state courts. So therefore, because a lot of people say, well, you've got the First Amendment and you've got the Religious Freedom Restoration Act on the national level, why do you need this? Because in 1997, the Supreme Court ruled it only applied to federal cases. It only applied to when the federal government was involved. And so after 1997, a number of states, including right-wing states like Connecticut and Illinois, began passing these kind of simple, modest protections for their citizens. Then State Senator Barack Obama didn't vote present. He actually voted yes on Illinois' version of RFRA, as we call it. Let me give you a couple of examples of why I think the Religious Freedom Restoration Act here in Georgia is important to think about cases, because when you talk about general applicability, when you talk about compelling state interest, those are kind of vague notions. And so how does that play out in real life? I want to give you 4 examples in other states where this has come into play. In the city of Philadelphia, the city government had passed a ban on feeding the homeless outdoors. People of faith said, well, my goodness, that is a direct restriction on what I believe my faith teaches me to do, to be involved in helping the poor. But because Pennsylvania had a state RFRA, again, yeah, that's the term I'll use from here on out, because Pennsylvania had a state RFRA, that ban was overturned. There was a church in Texas where that had to cease its prisoner reentry program for nonviolent offenders because of the local city ordinance. But because Texas had a state RFRA, that was overturned. Many observant Jews believe that the body ought not be disturbed after death, so they would object to an automatic routine autopsy. This is the clearest example to put your head around what's the difference between general applicability and compelling state interest. Because if someone is murdered, well, there's a compelling state interest in doing an autopsy and trying to determine what was the cause of death, how did this happen? But if someone dies of natural causes, why can't we just let them observe their religious traditions? And then the last one, Florida Atlantic University, there was a student who had objected to a classroom assignment where the professor had asked them to write out the name of Jesus and then stomp on it. And the student objected and said, no, this is a violation of my conscience. I'm not going to do that. And when he complained to the administration, they kicked him out of the class. And Florida has a state RFRA, and the student was then reinstated after public outcry and also knowing that the legal battle was not going to go Florida Atlantic University's way. The student was reinstated and all disciplinary action was dropped. I just came across a case here in the town of Ellijay, just a few minutes north of us, where organizers of a prayer chain were informed that they would have to get a permit before being allowed to have a group of people assemble on a sidewalk for quiet prayer. The organizers filed suit challenging the city ordinance requiring a permit for 3 or more persons to engage in peaceful demonstrations on public sidewalks. So I'm really not the guy who believes that there's a conspiracy in all of life. I'm generally a very optimistic guy. And so naturally there's the part of me that says, is there really a problem? And as I study this issue, there really is. And I think it is extremely important that we as Americans stand up and say, no, this is the First Amendment. There's a reason it was number one. There's a reason it was the First Amendment that we put in our Bill of Rights. Another thought along that line of, is this really important? I want to read to you a handful of the Bill of Rights. Amendment 1, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right to peaceably, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Amendment number 2, you may have heard of this one. A well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Amendment number 3, no soldier shall in the time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in manner to be prescribed by law. For my attorney friends, they're a big fan of the Seventh Amendment, which is the right to trial by jury in suits at common law where the value in controversy shall exceed $20. The right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by jury shall otherwise be re-examined in any court of the United States other than according to the rules of common law. Why do I read to you the Bill of Rights, the handful of the Bill of Rights? Why do you think our founders felt the need to put in the Bill of Rights? Is it because they wanted to go ahead and preach to the choir and say, yes, these are great things, and we've been doing, governments have been protecting these rights for so long, but we just want to, just kind of a little motion here to agree with how government has always treated the people? No. The reason we have the Bill of Rights, the reason we have the Constitution is to put limits on government, because historically, governments had violated issues of conscience. They had violated freedom of religion and freedom of the press and freedom of speech, freedom to defend yourself, the right to trial by jury, soldiers being quartered in people's homes. The reason we have those protections is because throughout all of human history, government has a history of violating people's natural rights. And so while I've grown up in a country and you've grown up in a country, and hopefully the children I have will continue to grow up in the freest nation on the planet, just because we've always had those freedoms doesn't mean we always will. And I'm not an alarmist, but I wonder if we are the proverbial frog in the kettle, that as things change gradually, we say, well, that freedom's not as important to me anymore. And even in the video that Rick just showed, there's, I think we need to be vigilant, that we protect the rights that we have always had. Let me read to you what is the operative language of the bill I've introduced. And again, this is pretty simple language, I think fairly easy for even a realtor like me to understand. So this is not a 2,000-page document. This doesn't have a lot of rules and regulations that come along with it. But rather, here's the operative language in the bill. Government shall not substantially burden a person's exercise of religion, even if the burden results from a rule of general applicability, except as provided in subsection B of this code section. Subsection B. Government may substantially burden a person's exercise of religion only if the government demonstrates that the application of such burden to a person is in furtherance of a compelling governmental interest and the least restrictive means of furthering that compelling governmental interest. In other words, in layman's terms, darn good reason. A person whose religious exercise has been burdened in violation of this chapter may assert that claim or defense in a judicial proceeding and obtain appropriate relief against government. So the whole point of this measure is to protect the individual from government, is to put some shackles on government so that it does not overreach. Again, as I believe government has had a history of doing throughout all of humankind. I believe RFRA enhances government governmental transparency and accountability because it requires government officials to justify any restrictions they impose on citizens' religious liberty. It thereby increases citizens' leverage in dealing with the government and incentivizes the government to find ways to achieve its interests while respecting citizens' religious liberty. So let me get to, at this point you're thinking, well, what's the controversy? Again, this is something that has brought Republicans and Democrats and conservatives and liberals together. At the time, unfortunately, members of the LGBT community felt like this was a backdoor attempt to institutionalize discrimination against those in the gay and lesbian community. To say that that is not true understates it. I believe in protecting the rights of conscience of all people, regardless of creed, regardless of whatever. I believe in respecting the rights of conscience. A number of us have said in the legislature that one of the phrases that kind of binds a lot of us together is the concept of the absolute right of conscience. It's very powerful to me. It's important that we defend it and we protect it. And so during this battle, during this bill, as I introduced it last year, the opposition came from the LGBT community, suggesting that we were trying to do something that I know that we were not trying to. And so it's funny because the Sunday before I was going to have a committee hearing, it had dawned on me I'm about to walk into a battle. Again, I had not expected to, but at this point, the Sunday before the Tuesday committee hearing, I realized, wow, this is going to be a difficult week. So I stand up in my Sunday school class and I say, just want to ask you guys to be in prayer for me. I think I've got a difficult week ahead of me. And I give a 10-second version of the bill, and would ask you to be in prayer for me that I represent the Lord well, that I'm calm and gracious, but also that there's favor in the political process. So Tuesday happens, and that was probably one of the most difficult days of my life. And called everything but, as I like to say, called everything but a child of God that day and for the rest of the week. And so I get into Sunday school class the next Sunday, and the Sunday school teacher says, "Hey Sam, can you tell us, how did that whole bill thing go?" Sure, I'll tell you. And so this time I stand up and I give a 3 or 4 minute version of what the bill does. And I said, one of the most disconcerting things is that people who were ideologically inclined to agree with me, people who were right of center even, got carried away by the media portrayal of what it did. I remember that Tuesday night being interviewed, I think it was by 11 Alive. And so they said, what does your bill do? What are you trying to accomplish? And I laid it out just as I did for you. And I said, okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate your time. So I had my wife DVR the 11 Alive coverage. So this ought to be interesting. I just want to see how this plays out on TV. It may not have been a wise choice. I got home and I watched the recording, and as it begins, it says, legalizing discrimination in Georgia. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've heard that Republicans and conservatives don't get a fair shake in the media, but when it happens to you go, my word, they were right. And so sure enough, so I'm explaining this to my Sunday school class, and I said, I've had people who are friends of mine who say, Sam, I can't believe you're doing that. And when I explain it to them, they go, oh, okay, that's not what they said it was. I attend one of the most theologically conservative churches in all of Metro Atlanta. I'd be willing to bet the vast majority of the congregation votes for people like me. I had someone in my own Sunday school class, a friend of mine, come up and say, I have to admit, I was one of those who was carried away by the media perception, the media portrayal of this bill. I'm really sorry. I want you to think on that for a minute. The power of the media to change people's minds, to convince them that it does something that it doesn't do, to essentially become activists against something they actually, if they were to think about it, they fundamentally believe. So I want to urge you, when you hear media portrayals of what your legislators are doing down at the Capitol, with the governor and the lieutenant governor and the attorney general, what they're doing down at the Capitol, please don't just accept what they say at face value. I know we know this. I mean, I knew it, but when it happened to me, it became far more real. My guess is you will encounter, and probably already have encountered, some misrepresentation. So with that, I just want to close by putting a thought in your mind, and then I want to open it up for a few questions. And I have no idea how long I've talked, so I know I was supposed to. 5 minutes. Okay, then I'll be brief. We've often heard stories about soldiers who are jeered and mocked and some people decry any kind of military action. And I'm sure you've heard some soldiers say, well, I'm fighting to defend their right to criticize me. And that's right. And so it is because as Americans, we are proud of our freedoms. We are proud of that First Amendment that gives the people the right to protest the military or whatever else that government does. But in that very same First Amendment that we're very proud of that protects free speech, there's also the protection we have for the free exercise of religions, and we need to fight for that as well. So with that, I'd love to answer any questions about the process or any of that. Yes, ma'am.
What kind of pushback have you gotten within the Conservatives and the Republican Party for the tendency to not think of a business owner as an individual in the case of like the Christian bakers that didn't want
Sure.
to bake the wedding cake?
Right. And let me speak to that. Because that was certainly one of the ideas that came up. In Georgia, that's actually a moot point at this point because of the way the Georgia Constitution is defined as it relates to marriage. The whole baker scenario is not a possibility at this point. It may be
But
someday.
if it was.
It may be someday. So that was not the motivation behind the bill, so to speak. I think people. One of the things that Clinton said is we need to be careful not to run away from our convictions. Having the right to express our religion also doesn't mean we should run away from our convictions. When I've turned the question around, and I said again, that issue doesn't apply right now, but imagine the shoe being on the other foot. Do we believe, if you're concerned that gays will be discriminated against, doesn't the idea of protecting religious expression, protecting free speech also protect the gay from being discriminated? From if you flip the argument around, the baker is concerned that they have to do something that violates their conscience. But I would suggest that the First Amendment and the Religious Freedom Restoration Act also protects someone in the gay community from having to do something outside of their own conviction. So,
But in a society where there's 25 bakers to choose from,
right.
I mean, they're not being denied their right to have a wedding cake. They're being denied to have it be forcibly done by an individual.
Right. And usually when I say, I remember one specific conversation I had with a friend of mine, longtime friend of mine, very conservative Republican. I said, at issue, do we really think that government ought to compel a business owner to do something against their will?
Right.
And he goes, I hadn't thought about it that way. I said, that is what this bill is about, is putting shackles on government from forcing people to do things against their conscience.
So you do feel like it has some amount of protections in there for an individual as a business owner as well as an individual just as an individual?
I don't know that I'm legally qualified to answer that question. I'm not trying to dodge you here.
That's fine.
I don't want to give a legal opinion on that.
Just trying to think forward.
Sure. And I'll stay here for a little while after we're done. I'd be glad to talk with you further.
I mean, let's take it out of LGBT and think of it like, what if I'm a t-shirt company and I don't want to put Che Guevara on my t-shirt?
Right.
I mean, that's socialism, communism,
Sure.
arguably against my conscience of freedom. So it's not just about.
In that specific case, obviously, I think the t-shirt owner ought to have the right to say, no, I'm not going to do socialism rules. Right.
And just one quick follow-up to that. The state of Georgia has the ability to deny a license plate based on moral turpitude.
Sure.
So if the state's allowed to do it, why would a business owner not be allowed to do do it.
Fair question. Yes, sir.
Where is the bill now in the legislative
Thank you.
process?
And every time I talk, I was like, I got something to say. That's a major point of what I wanted to say. I am reintroducing the bill. I've been working since session got out. One of the major obstacles we had last session is there were a number of major players in the business community who came out against it. Big names. And that really made people slow down and say, wait a minute. And so at that point, when major players in the business community said, we don't think this is a good measure, I made the strategic decision. Said here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop pushing this bill this session. I'm going to talk with concerned parties, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to reintroduce it next year because I wanted to give them an opportunity to give me some input. This was not an act of timidity on my part, but rather I wanted to go back and seize the moral high ground.
So it's essentially started a new 2-year cycle.
Right, right. And the way the legislature works, in an odd numbered year, 2015 or 2013, bills are introduced and they carry over in between sessions while you're still in the same term. That term has ended and a new term will begin come January 2015. So yes, I will be reintroducing it. I'll be reintroducing it, and hopefully we'll have a little bit more support this time. And so I certainly would encourage you to be in contact with your political leaders here on the state legislative level, the governor's office, the lieutenant governor. They need to know this is important. If this is important to you, let them know that, because if political leaders only hear from one side, then they go, okay, well, it's not worth the fight. And I know you had a question, and Jack has a question. Go for it.
The question I have, that's a good segue to it, is in that same First Amendment, there's the freedom of press and freedom of speech. What plans do you have, or what would you consider to utilize? And you mentioned the media earlier, how they turn this thing around.
Right.
We have a new media, we have social media. Have you made plans, or have you already made plans to help get the message out, starting basically now, and how can the folks in this room help do that? To kind of feel the soil.
Sure. Yes, but I'm always willing to receive input on better ways I can do that. So let's talk offline, and I'd be glad to get your suggestions because I certainly I don't cover it all. So do I have time for one more?
Last question.
Jack.
Who were the major players, Sam, that were against it?
Public record.
Oh, buddy.
Delta, Coca-Cola, and Home Depot were the ones who released statements expressing concern. And we've talked offline a number of times, and I think we're having a very positive dialogue right now. We'll see come January, but I think I've been encouraged by the dialogue that we've had here in the last several months. So.
Great, thanks very much, Sam.